It's been a tremendous day so far, and we have now reached Susie Dent's keynote speech and the last talk of the conference. For those of you who don't know, Susie is a lexicographer, linguist, etymologist, best-selling author, broadcaster, queen of Dictionary Corner, honorary fellow of CIOL, and one of our vice presidents. In Susie's talk, The Emotional Dictionary, she will explore the importance of emotional vocabulary and how it is too often overlooked. Research is proving that the higher our EQ, or emotional intelligence, the more we are able to harness and cope with our emotions. Susie will explore some of the very best words from the past, those from other languages that fill a distinct gap in English, and introduce some that have been recently crafted to express how we feel. Susie, it's lovely to have you with us. We'll now pass the controls over to you.
Thank you so much, and hello everyone. I am now showing my screen.
Wonderful.
Apparently. Okay, would you like me to get rid of me in the corner there? There you go.
It's entirely up to you. If you want to leave your camera on, we can see the presentation and you. That's great.
Yeah, if you can see me as well. I just don't want to see myself, so I'm going to put myself over there. But hello, and thank you so much for having me. It's quite strange doing online conferences, but also I find it quite reassuring. I don't know if any of you have got sort of echoes of the pandemic when we were all fairly isolated, but also somehow connected through these online spaces. And I think all of us experienced so many different emotions during that time. And it prompted me to think, as you've just heard, about our emotions and how we articulate them. And I'm just going to kick off with a poll, actually, which draws on an experience that I have certainly had quite a few times. So hopefully there's going to be a poll coming your way.
Yes, that certainly is. So there we go. Have you at some point given an approving nod to your hairdresser when you actually hate what you see in the mirror? And if we could get the votes coming in, and we'll hold this open while people are voting just a little bit longer, Susie.
Of course.
Let's say another 5 seconds because the votes are still coming in. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so we have 79% who have at some point given an approving nod to the hairdresser when they actually hate what they see in the mirror.
Well, thanks, Ron, for that. Well, that's fairly clear to me, although how I envy those 21%. I had absolutely no idea until recently that there was a word for this, which you are now seeing on your screen. So in Japanese, age otori means the misery of a bad haircut. And I think it explains a little bit, you know, that emotion that we experience when we are dying a little bit on the inside, but actually trying to reassure our hairdresser on the outside. And it's just such a, I don't think it's particularly British either. I think it's just such a strange reservation that actually very few of us can say, I absolutely hate it. But age otori, it was a recent discovery for me. And as I say, during the pandemic, there were so many emotions that I was going through that didn't come neatly packaged. They were sort of complex and incredibly hard to fathom very often. And I remember coming across a word in the Oxford English Dictionary, which is many of you absolute Bible, and it was the word lonesome fret, hyphenated, which basically means anxious from being on one's own for too long. And it seems such a perfect articulation, as I say, of what so many of us were feeling, I think, at that time. And then towards the end of the pandemic, I remember discovering the most beautiful French word, which many of you will know, retrouvailles, which is the joy of reuniting with someone after a long time apart. And so it sort of came full circle for me. And I spent so many of the intervening months looking at the vocabulary of our emotions, because as you've just heard, it is so important, and this is something else that I discovered. The research that has been undertaken just into the importance and the value of being able to express how we feel. And I suppose that very question, how do we feel, it punctuates our lives. It's this sort of ultimate summary, isn't it, of every life event and situation, whether we are experience grief, whether we've been promoted, dumped, or struck down by flu. It just encompasses so many things, and usually the answer will involve varying degrees of usually 6 basic emotions, which are happiness, sadness, disgust, surprise, fear, and anger. But as many of you will know, those just only go so far, and there are so many nuances within each of those categories. So I've tried to unearth as many words from our language and from other languages as I can, just to try and express that vast array of feelings that many of us experience every day. Some of them are very light-hearted. So any of us who have had a dog, or have a dog at the moment, for example, will know exactly what I mean by groaking when I tell you its translation. To groak of a dog, and sometimes occasionally of a human if there are chips around, is to stare longingly at someone else's food in the hope that they might share. Who knew that there was actually a word for that? Groaking, which is G-R-O-A-K-I-N-G. It's just perfect. I think too many of us also will acknowledge the feeling of Eilkrankheit, which any Germanists amongst you will know. So this is German for hurry sickness. And essentially, it describes the endless chasing of our tails that we all do. We never quite get to the result that we want to, because there is always something a little bit ahead. Lexicographers do this all the time, and linguists do as well. Samuel Johnson actually put it beautifully when it came to trying to capture language. He said, "We are forever chasing the sun." And that for me too is Eilkrankheit. Linguists and lexicographers are desperately trying to chase the words that will forever be eluding us. So Eilkrankheit and hurry sickness for me, it just encompasses so many different situations. As an antidote though, it's worth remembering something from Japan. Now Japan, as many of you will know, does nature incredibly well. So just the annual ritual of observing cherry blossom, for example, which is a real family event, is something incredibly important every single year. And they are also great advocates of Shinrin Yoku. Now, this is forest bathing. It doesn't look like this, sadly, but this is essentially the relaxation and the recombobulation that we feel when we are beneath a canopy of trees, and usually on our own. So the Germans called this Waldeinsamkeit, forest solitude. But there are so many, or there is so much evidence that shows that actually forest bathing, Waldeinsamkeit, whatever you want to call it, it lowers cortisol levels, it raises our serotonin levels, not unlike swearing, actually. Swearing has exactly the same function physiologically. It does exactly the same thing in terms of raising our serotonin levels, and of course, blunting pain, etc. I'm sure I've spoken about this to you before, the power of swearing, but I think most of us probably would prefer a bit of Shinrin Yoku. But how wonderful that there is now actually a word for it, and we haven't yet quite caught up. Japanese also offers really pithy words, I think, for other situations, and this one really reminded me of the pandemic. Kuchi sabishi is essentially going to the fridge again and again in the hope of finding something new. And if you translate it literally, kuchi sabishi means lonely mouth. You are eating because your mouth is lonely. And I think, again, that encompasses so many different emotions. It's not just comfort eating, there's something more to it as well, which I think is quite beautiful. How about pregret? Now, pregret, as you heard at the beginning, there are some very recent coinages actually which are attempting to express emotions that we perhaps haven't been able to before. I'm sure in classical Greek In fact, I know there were words to express this, but I think pre-gret does it very beautifully. It's a really good example of a portmanteau, a blend, which actually accounts for about 40% actually of all new words at the moment. We take existing words or components of existing words and create these mashups. And pre-gret essentially is knowing you are going to regret something, but going ahead and doing it anyway. For me, that absolutely encompasses late night shopping online, when you really know that you just shouldn't be doing this, but you go ahead anyway. That is pre-gret. More seriously, there is the most beautiful word in Old English that expresses that peculiar sense of doom or anxiety that many of us feel in the dark hours just before dawn. For the Anglo-Saxons, it was HonFCIL, kind of dawn sorrow, really, the sorrow of the dawn. And, you know, this is the time when I think problems seem disproportionately huge and insurmountable. And of course, when the daylight comes, things slowly, usually, and hopefully become a little bit better. But HonFCIL, there is reassurance, I think, in the knowledge that people have been feeling this for centuries, almost over a millennium. Another morning emotion that many of you might recognise is idiorepulsive. Now, this essentially means self-repellent. So for me, this is the morning stare into the mirror. It's always struck me as being incredibly ironic that at the heart of the word mirror is the Latin mirare, meaning to stare in wonder or to marvel. It's the source of miracle as well. And how many of us actually see a miracle in the mirror? I think not many of us. So idiorepulsive to me as well fills a gap, for sure. If you want to express melancholy, and melancholy itself actually goes back to the Greek for black bile, because they thought it was due to a preponderance of really horrible stuff as part of the bodily humours, which many of you will know about. But centuries ago, they had a much sort of cuddlier way of describing a fit of melancholy or the blues. These were the mubble-fubbles. And I often think mubble-fubbles perfectly articulate the Sunday evening sense of impending doom. Many people don't like Sunday evenings, and mubble-fubbles somehow cheers you up whilst expressing the very thing that you are feeling. And also knowing that there is a word for the pang of emotion that you feel or might feel when you smell a particular perfume, or you hear a particular song, or even a beat of music, and it takes you back to a particular memory. It's like a stab. It can be a pleasurable stab, but it can be a stab of pain and sad memories, I suppose. But just the very fact that there is a word for it, astound, not astound obviously, but astound, I think is beautiful. And there are so many lost positives in the dictionary as well, which I know I've spoken to you about before. Who couldn't take joy in apricity, a word that I am desperate to bring back? In fact, I'm on a bit of a mission to bring back. So for those of you who follow me on Twitter X, you will have seen this many a time. Apricity is essentially the warmth of the sun on your back on a winter's day. Yeah, what more should I say, except weather forecasters are starting to pick this up, which makes me extremely happy. And there is rispair, the opposite to despair. And rispair is both a verb and a noun, and it means fresh hope or a recovery from despair. I think there hasn't been a New Year's Eve when I haven't tweeted this word, at least for the last 4 or 5 years, in the hope that finally this will be a year when we all feel rispair, and indeed when we suspire and let out a deep sigh. I'm not sure it's come yet, but there is a word for it, so there is hope. Now, why am I telling you all of these? Well, I've sort of hinted at the importance of emotions, but not the kind of research behind it. There is something called emotional granularity. Now, this was a term that was coined by a psychology professor, Lisa Feldman Barrett. And she did a lot of work showing that those of us who can draw on a wider range of vocabulary to express how we are feeling are more able to cope with them. So emo-diverse people, essentially, we're less likely to lash out in anger. We're less likely to hit the bottle. We are less likely to go to the doctors, and we are generally happier. And it is all about being able to name what we feel. Now, I suppose in some ways this isn't particularly surprising, because obviously it means you can communicate better and you can convey the nuances of what you're feeling more articulately. But I don't think I realised just the extent to which we are happier and healthier by having emotional granularity and having this emotional vocabulary. And there is in folklore, sorry, I forgot to add confelicity, which is one of my favourite positives. Just to let you know that one, confelicity is, it's just beautiful. It is essentially joy in someone else's happiness. And I just expressed it there with watching a child open a gift at Christmas time, but it's just a very, very beautiful word. It's not quite the opposite of Schadenfreude, but it is there in the dictionary, ready to be taken up whenever we want it. But going back to naming things and the power of naming things, there is, as I say, in folklore, there's a bit of a law of names, and it states that knowing the name for something allows us in a way to magically govern it. And I'm not sure that is the real Rumpelstiltskin, but the Rumpelstiltskin effect is what I've called this, because many of you will remember the tale of Rumpelstiltskin, in which a mother can only rescue her child from the clutches of a really malevolent imp by finding out its name. And it seems an absolute impossibility. And those of you who know, I'm not sure I can do a spoiler of centuries old fairy tale, but I won't spoil it for you. But she does discover the name, and she does rescue her child. And I feel that there is something very similar going on with emotions, that actually, as I say, just having a word for whatever it is that we are experiencing gives us that power, the power of the name. Now, I've spent, I suppose, all this time outlining different emotions, but what exactly is an emotion? And this is a huge subject. You know, is it an inner sensation, or is it more something like a social scenario? Are our emotions and our feelings innate, or are they a way of behaving that we learn as we grow up? And then do we feel something and then name it, or is it the other way around? And I remember my surprise when I learned that in the 19th century, the word boredom didn't exist. It just wasn't around. Before then, it was ennui. Now, ennui for me is slightly different. It's languishing, it's slightly world weary, it's back of the hand to the head, that kind of emotion. Whereas boredom is something rather different. And of course, many of us are encouraged to be bored and to let our children be bored. So we are recognizing the positive effects of boredom as well. And putting a name on our emotions has never quite been straightforward, because even when we found a name, its meaning could shift over time. So we might assume that we've always acted and felt the way that we do, but that isn't actually always the case. So smiling, for example, was once less a reflection of joy and much more the grin of fear exhibited, for example, by primates when they're faced with danger. And happy smiles only really emerged, we think, a little bit later, and even then only when good dentistry appeared, obviously, as well. So we were pretty tight-lipped before then. And similarly, yawning. Yawning today, we hopefully, I can't see any of you, so hopefully you're not yawning. And I suspect that if I could see you, many of you would be nodcrafty, by the way. Nodcrafty is a brilliant word from the 17th century, which essentially means having the knack of nodding your head as if you understand absolutely everything that someone is telling you when you actually tuned out ages ago. Anyway, back to yawning, which hopefully none of you are doing. In Shakespeare's time, a yawner would actually be less bored and tired and more open-mouthed with astonishment, really. It was just an awesome, in its literal sense, word. And earlier still, if someone yawned particularly loudly, they were thought to be risking themselves up to the devil, because the devil then might take over their body. On the other hand, French troubadours, going back to the 12th century, for example, would yawn vigorously to demonstrate the depths of their love, which is quite extraordinary too. So our emotions and our bodily exhibitions of those emotions really are as fluid and probably as inconstant as we are as well. And sometimes the evolution of emotions can be really dramatic. Was it keeping on the time here? Yeah. 400 years ago, for example, there was a really curious illness and a pretty nasty illness that was observed amongst Swiss mercenaries who were fighting outside their country, and they were considered to be some of the most highly prized soldiers in Europe. But it was noted that they actually were going down with a pretty horrible affliction, which involved fevers, it involved abdominal pain, nausea, fainting, and sometimes even death. And it was known as mal de Suisse because it was observed amongst the Swiss mercenaries, so the Swiss disease. Now, it's not unusual to name a disease after its country of provenance. So, for example, syphilis was given various names by different countries who unsurprisingly blamed it on someone else. So mal de Naples, or Naples, I suppose, the Neapolitan disease was what we called it over here, and the French too, or Neapolitan bone ache was another name for it. Whereas I think the Italians then in turn called it morbus gallus in Latin, which meant the French disease. We've always blamed other nations. But in this mal de Suisse, it was because it was thought to have originated in Switzerland. But why? Well, some people thought that actually it was caused by the continuous clanging of cowbells in the childhood of these mercenaries. And so they thought it was some neurological or just very strange disease that only affected this particular group of people. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau was the one who later described how the mercenaries dissolved in tears, deserted, or were left heartbroken. So powerfully did the song arouse in them the ardent desire to see their homeland once more. And you've probably guessed already that mal de Suisse, the Swiss disease, was later renamed by a Swiss physician actually in 1688, and he renamed it nostalgia. But how terrible a thing it was and how awful a beginning it had. Whereas now, if we think about nostalgia, we might assume, 1970s disco nights or album covers or prawn cocktails, that kind of thing. We don't really ever think about how it may have originated, but our emotions, as you can see, have really shifted quite fundamentally over time. So yeah, COVID lockdowns, immersing myself in the language of feeling, it took me, I suppose, on a really useful emotional roller coaster. Useful because I began to think about all of these lost words and how we might resurrect them to be able to achieve that emotional granularity and express exactly how we feel. So I spun all the way from words like the Italian abbiocco, which essentially is the drowsiness you feel after a very big meal, to the most beautiful word and the last in the English dialect dictionary, zwodder. It's from the West Country, and it essentially is the laziness and the languor that you might feel on a hot summer's day, zwodder, which is just absolutely beautiful. And reading all of the ancient dictionaries that I have on my shelves, as well as some of the newer ones, and of course trawling online, because online spaces now have given us a wonderful opportunity to capture lost vocabulary, particularly dialect words and local language. I discovered limerence. So limerence is a word that was directly coined quite recently, actually, for the exhilaration that you feel when you first fall in love. Limerence, which is just beautiful. And well, I've mentioned German, and just a word for German, which was my first love. I'm sure I've told you about it before. I find it such a lyrical and deep and gnarly language, and I know it has quite a tricky reputation, but usually when it comes to linguistic gaps, and particularly when it comes to emotions, people say, well, I bet the Germans have a word for it. And it always reminds me of this great book that was written by Ben Schott. If I haven't told you about it before, Ben Schott wrote this book called Schadenfreude. And essentially he got a German translator to to basically make up a German word for any linguistic gap that Ben Schott himself had identified. And it led to some absolute wonders, such as Deppenfahrerbeäugung, which is the compulsion to stare at the bad driver that you're overtaking in your car, or Überraschungsparty, Überraschungsheuchelei, which is surprise party, surprise hypocrisy. And that is pretending to be surprised by a surprise party that you're really not surprised by, and so on and so on. But you know what? German often really does have a word for it. Famously, it is a little like Lego, and you can build anything out of it. And one of my favorites, because it directly pertains to me very, very often, is the word Verschlimmbesserung. And Verschlimmbesserung essentially is an attempted improvement that actually ends up making things much, much worse. But when it comes to emotional vocabulary, we really cannot make things worse by learning some new words for how we feel. Some of them are silly, some of them are incredibly light-hearted, but some of them are really quite fundamental. And as I say, the more we can do it, the more I think we will benefit from it and see the results in so many aspects of our lives. And we may or may not reach cloud 9, which is what that is doing there. Cloud 9 from supposedly the International Cloud Atlas, which was a book which labels and categorized different types of cloud. And the cumulonimbus was number 9, which of course is the loftiest and fluffiest. And so if you're on cloud 9, you're in a very good place indeed. And as I mentioned, let's not just dwell on the sad side of life, because if words have that power, and if naming words also has the phenomenal power that it seems to have, then actually retraining our mind to reach back to the lost positives, I suppose it's an example of manifesting in some way. We may then in turn begin to feel those positive emotions. Lots of research shows that actually, even if life is incredibly tough, forcing our face into the forcing our facial muscles into a smile can actually really improve things. So it is the same with language. And if you haven't heard me talk about lost positives before, I'm talking about words like gormful. You can be full of gorm. You can be full of ruth as well as ruthless. You can be feckful. You can be gruntled, thanks to P.G. Woodhouse. And you can be a persona grata. You can be wieldy and couth. And there are so many out there. You can be whelmed as well, by the way, but that simply meant capsized. I'm often asked that one too. But, you know, such happinesses really were abandoned in favor of their antitheses. But, you know, if psychologists are right, if Lisa Feldman Barrett is right, and we can grasp that emotional granularity, then we can experience them once more. And a true name and a real name can actually break, hopefully, any bad spell that might come our way. We just need to choose our words better. And I think if ever there was a time to release the magic of despair, then it is surely now. I would absolutely love some questions from you, which is always my favorite part, and it's just always quite odd not being able to hear you. But if there are any emotions that you can think of that actually you feel there should be a name for, I would absolutely love it. I'm sure I won't have names for many of them, but it just goes to show that there is still a lot of work to be done. So I'm guessing, Don, that I will be able to see any questions over here somewhere.
I don't think you will, Susie, but I will be able to see them, so I'll read them out. We have had a couple of words come in already, but do put them in the chat. Just to say also, we had an example right at the start of today's conference, sobremesa, which in Spanish is the time you spend after lunch chatting with your friends.
That is just beautiful, and I think we don't have it because we tend not to linger after our dinner. We don't sit at the table, and unless we're on holiday, it seems to me. There is also, in many of you will know, the Swedish fika, and that is having a coffee and a piece of cake with friends as well. They actually have a name for it, which I think is glorious. They do that kind of coziness and hygge very well. That's Danish, I think, but yeah, Scandinavia does it particularly well. So that's a really nice one.
Very nice. Okay, so we've had a classic one actually, Portuguese saudade.
Yes.
a way of expressing the deep feeling for missing someone you love.
That is beautiful, and not just someone, but I think also somewhere. I think other languages do longing particularly well. German, I know, as well as homesickness. They have far sickness in Heimweh, which is the longing. Sorry, Foundweh, which is the longing to be far away. And in Wales, of course, in Welsh, they have hiraeth, which is famously that sort of longing for home. But it might be a home that you've never experienced. It's just that sort of yearning. And saudade, I think, is, for me, is a little bit like that. It's a yearning that you can't quite put your finger on always, and yet which is, you know, all-consuming, and it's very beautiful. So thank you for that one.
Wonderful. And we actually had here suggested by a couple of people in the chat as well as we were going through that. So here, this is so upbeat and inspiring, Susie. You've turned word loss on its head. I love German. It's such a creative language. I just came across the German noun, and oh dear, I'm regretting reading this one. Pilzwiderstandsfähigkeit. I don't know.
What does that mean? It's I'm sure it's completely impossible to pronounce anywhere for anyone.
Apparently that's disease resistance grapes for sustainability.
Oh wow, that's incredible. I think it was Mark Twain, the writer, who hated German. He tried to learn it, but he absolutely hated it. And he said something like, whenever a German dives into the Atlantic with a noun in his mouth, he will emerge on the other side of it with a verb or something similar. Because it is grammatically, it's also quite complicated, but it's just beautiful. Oh, here's my cat to say hello as well. I'm sure there should be a word for a cat who is essentially about to step on your keyboard and conduct official embezzlement. But that's a lovely one.
But very good, very good. Suggestion here for a word for the love-hate paradox.
The love-hate paradox, yes. Gosh. That's really good. I can't come up with something on that. That's that kind of that combination of two extremes. I love that one. I'm going to write that one down. Thank you, because I would agree that we need that. Thank you. Something popped into my head then. Oh yes, I think quite a modern expression of an emotion is actually really good because it does exactly what it says on the tin, and it's probably straight from Love Island, I think, which is the ick. I know my kids talk about the ick all the time, but it just, everybody knows what you mean. It's like, oh, it's giving me the ick, and usually in the context of dating. But I think that's quite, it's not particularly poetic or, you know, eloquent, but it is absolutely nails it.
Very good, very good. And a question here as I work my way down, how do you find and collate all these new words to specific subject areas? Yes.
Well, my biggest friend of the last few years has been not just the Oxford English Dictionary, which is my Bible, and that is, as most of you will know, that's not the current English dictionary. This is a historical dictionary in one sense, in that it shows you the very earliest meaning of a particular word and then tracks its journey all the way through English. But it also is charting new words all the time, so it's an ongoing endeavour that you know, that charts the evolution of English as it is going on at the moment. But within the Oxford English Dictionary, there has been for a while now the most wonderful tool, which is a historical thesaurus. And what this enables you to do is to go to any word and you will see the synonyms for it throughout history. And that is obviously organised thematically. So you can go into that historical thesaurus and you can pinpoint an emotion, if you can even think of an approximation of a word for it. So I could put in fear and I might see all the calibrations of fear and different words for it. It won't give you everything because, as I mentioned, local words and local language have been really hard to capture within traditional dictionaries because they are so much part of an oral tradition that they haven't really been written down. But what online spaces are now doing is are enabling us to swap our family expressions and to talk about the words that we grew up with and the mashups that we're creating ourselves based on those generational lexicons. And so now dialect vocabulary is actually going in. But I have lots of dialect glossaries, which I will dip into as well. And frankly, I do genuinely read dictionaries because that's so much more fun than it sounds. But I don't think I need to convince anybody in the audience, actually, because we're all linguists together. But that is the way that I now, well, not now, I've always noted things, and now I put them on my phone in my little note section. I used to have endless notebooks. I've got so many notebooks in my attic in which I've scribbled things down. But now it's my phone, and I just collate them and then try and shape them all together when I need to.
Brilliant, brilliant. Okay. Suggestion, is there a word for hatred for extremes?
A hatred for extremes. I've just realised that the reason I can't hear you, and you might be able to hear me too well, is that I wasn't on my own microphone. Do I sound a bit better now?
You sound absolutely fine, Susie.
Oh,
great.
Good. So a hatred of extremes. I think that's such a relevant question now, more than any other time, really, when we are, it seems, particularly on social platforms, we're not particularly allowed to be nuanced. We have to be either in one camp or the other. And there doesn't seem to be much room for debate in the middle spaces, which is really sad. So I don't know if there is a word for the hatred of extremes. It's slightly like the love-hate paradox, I suppose. But yeah, I don't know. I think phobia would be at the end of it, obviously. But I don't know what would come at the beginning. Normally, when it comes to phobias, we borrow from ancient Greek, even if there wasn't a word in ancient Greek. So famously, coulrophobia, which is the fear of clowns. They didn't have clowns in ancient Greece, but they did have stilt walkers, so those walking on stilts to perform. So coulro actually, I think, means stilt walker. But I think it would be based on that. But I don't have a ready answer for that. But it's a really, really good question.
Okay, there's plenty more words coming in. A suggestion that sevda is very similar to saudade. So sevda is a Bosnian word very similar to saudade. One that makes me smile, umarel, which is Bolognese dialect, so it's Italian dialect for retired men who pass their time watching construction sites, often with their hand behind their back. And I know all about this.
Perfect.
Yes,
and that's a really good example, actually. I can't use Daniel Manotti. I can't remember his surname, but it's quite a recent coinage, and it really took off because everybody can picture that. And I think you might also find similar examples here. But again, it's such a kind of cultural reference, isn't it? A hot country, you can imagine them either playing boule or actually standing by construction sites. And it is a really good one. I was just going to say, sometimes I have to check myself because it's very tempting to invest particular emotions with real power when actually in their native language they're just kind of, they're sort of quite run-of-the-mill words. So I remember making a huge thing of a Finnish word, sisu, and I remember mentioning it in the context of the Ukrainians at war. And sisu is grit and determination and resilience to stick something out to the end. And there is a word in English for that. It's pertolerance, which has been lost really. It's to endure until the very end. But a Finnish correspondent got in touch and said, yeah, sisu is a lovely word, but actually, do you know what? It's not that big. And so it's really interesting. It was a very good lesson to me not to over dramatize or invest with real poetry words that actually are quite run-of-the-mill in their own country. So that taught me.
Fabulous. Okay, there's so many more suggestions. We're not going to be able to have time to get all of them. I'll read two more comments, and you can pick one to answer, Susie.
Okay.
So romance exists, but is there a word that conveys the same feeling between women, such as womance?
Yeah, good one. Sistrance. Doesn't sistrance sounds nice? Sistrance, doesn't it? But bromance, again, everybody knows what it means. So it's one of the most successful blends of recent times. But yeah, very, very good point. I don't have a word for that.
Okay, and just in 1 minute, how do you remember all these amazing words, Susie? Do you learn them like foreign language vocabulary, or do you naturally absorb them?
It's because I bore everyone rigid by talking about them all the time. So the only way that I can remember these things is by mentioning them over and over. And in the podcast that I do with Giles Brandreth, I have a little trio of words at the end of every episode. And Giles always says, I'm never going to remember these. So we now just try and use them as much as we can. And that's the only way that I can get it to go in. I can write them down endlessly, but I think you just actively have to use them in context. And I also hope that by doing so, I might breathe a little bit more life into them, because you know that a word has really made it if you can use it without explanation and without needing to gloss it for somebody. So yes, it's just by boring people, I'm afraid, Dom.
That's brilliant, Susie. You're certainly not boring anybody. Thank you so much for that. We have actually now reached the end of the conference. Susie, I know you've got to dash, so thank you once again.
Thank you to everybody, and I'm really sorry I couldn't see anyone. And if you were nod crafty, that's a really good thing. But if you were smiling, thank you for the smiles, and hopefully see you soon.
Wonderful. Okay. So thank you. Also, Susie, you may go. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you to all our attendees for attending and contributing to CIOL's online conference. I'm sure we can all agree it's been an absolutely fascinating day.